your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. This is the Atheist Manifesto. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Atheist Manifesto. I am your host, Callie Wright, and just like last week, this week's episode is going to feature an interview I recorded for the other podcast I was producing for a while. As I explained last week, the time just isn't there for me to produce two podcasts at this point in my life, but this story is so important, it has to be shared, and it is absolutely an honor to get to share this story with you. This week, we're going to meet Robin, and I'll be honest and say I'm having trouble summing up Robin's story in this introduction here. So we've all seen movies like Forrest Gump, right? Or The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. And there are these epic stories of lives that are super difficult to contain in a single narrative. They go through things that are super difficult to hear about, and we can understandably wonder how they survived. And indeed, many people with similar stories don't survive. Robin, I love you, my friend, and I hope I do your story justice here. And I will tell you, our interview was long enough. I actually had to split this into two parts. So this week, we're going to hear the story of Robin hitting rock bottom from drug abuse. And next week, we're going to learn about his recovery. Listener, take note. This story contains graphic descriptions of sexual violence, drug abuse, religious abuse, and death.
My name is Robin. I also go by Rob to some of my friends. I live in Tennessee. I've lived pretty much all over the U.S. at one point or another. I'm a grad student in special education. Other than that, I've had an interesting journey to get where I am. I'm a pansexual trans man. I'm also what I consider recovering from a religion, not so much associated with the organization, but I'm kind of done with what I've been told to think and trying to figure out what I think for myself at this point in my life. I was born in Dayton, Ohio. I'm the child of a military man and a very strong, determined woman. So despite the fact that my dad was an officer in the military, gender roles weren't really enforced. My mom also had her master's and was very independent. At 4 years old, we moved here to this area in Tennessee, which was interesting for me because I hadn't started school, but all my siblings were 8, 10, and 12 years older than me. So they moved to Tennessee after living in Ohio, and I'm guessing from coming to visit here, you already can tell there's a little difference. We lived here for 4 years, and then we went on to D.C. So most of my childhood was actually as an independent child because all my siblings graduated before the moving started with me. But my mom went to work at a correction facility and my dad was full-time at the Pentagon. And so most of my childhood in D.C. was without a parent or guardian around. My sister was around, who was 18, but she also worked. My sister was basically the one who raised me. And so she did the best she could with what she had, but I had a lot of medical things going on, and she actually saved my life a couple times through my childhood. So she feels very responsible for me. After I fell from a tree swing, I jarred my spine on the root that was in the ground, and it pressed it up into my brain. And I started having seizures unexpectedly as I was a child. And so when I was in third grade, I started going to the hospital in D.C. And being out of school a lot, which put me behind my peers. But I did make my best friend in the hospital that was there. But she also had cancer. And so in third and fourth grade, I watched my best friend die. And so that was the start of me living in D.C. And then about fourth grade, my brother was sent to Desert Shield. And so I developed insomnia. I quit sleeping because I would watch the TV and wait for news about him because cell phones weren't a thing then. And the only thing I knew about war was what I had seen on the Wonder Years. And so you see Vietnam and you see people watching for the names of the dead. And so that's what I would stay up all night and do. And then I would watch as my dad would put on his military uniform in the morning, and I would help him tie his tie. And he always used to tell me that sometimes we put on an outfit that makes us feel strong to face the day. And I remember the first time I put on a tie, thinking back to that moment when my brother was overseas and my dad showed me how to tie a tie, which was, for somebody assigned female at birth, that was something very unique at that point after burying your best friend and being in 4th grade. But I started writing poetry in class when I would get done with my homework. And my teacher took up my poem. I thought I was in trouble. And then I got put in this special class. And I thought it was before my behavior. It turns out it was a gifted class. I didn't find that out till I graduated high school. And so there was me, a deaf girl, and somebody from Japan that didn't speak English. So I was in a room with 2 other people that I couldn't communicate with. And so that's how I spent 4th and 5th grade. And then my sister went off to college, and it was just me. And I had a babysitter down the road. It wasn't somebody that my parents picked as the first choice, but it's somebody that I gravitated towards, who they were unaware at the time also sold heroin on the side. And in 5th grade, I started running heroin for my babysitter around DC. And I used it once when I was in DC, but all of a sudden, I felt different. And I didn't know whether I felt good or bad, but the anxiety stopped. I could sleep. My mind wasn't running 50 million times. And that was both exciting and scary. And I wasn't a person who knew anybody to talk to about it. So that's kind of how my journey with drugs started. But then I moved back to Tennessee. They had rented out the house while we were in DC because they knew they wanted to retire there. When I got back here, I didn't have access to that. So I basically went cold turkey withdrawal going in the summer of my 6th grade year. But I had to lay down drugs, but I also had to lay down orchestra, which had been like my saving grace because they don't have a program here.
What do you play?
Cello. I play a lot of things, but I played cello then. There was something about the vibration of wood against my body that was calming. There was something about hearing the harmonics rather than the dissonance that felt natural to me. And to this day, I still play guitar. I play whatever instrument I could get my hand on. I play drums. I found a way to have an outlet with that. But I was heartbroken when I had to miss my last concert. I ended up really sick, and my teacher didn't believe me. And then I ended up collapsing in the hallway at at middle school. And because I went over to the middle school for math class. I was that kid. And so I collapsed in the hallway. And I ended up with 105 temperature, having mono, and my sister had to put me in a bathtub of ice to bring me back. So this was the second time that I had been revived from something that was pretty deadly, and I hadn't really started middle school yet. So that was a lot right before I moved to Tennessee. And then I came back to see all the people in a small town that had known each other their whole life, that had formed those bonds, that had lived in a different world than I had. And so
you came home, but you were the new kid at home.
Again, like they knew my name. Every girl in my grade had gone to Brownies with me. My mom had been their scout leader. So they knew this 2nd grade version of me, which at that point, all I wanted was approval. And we were kind of corralled together, and people were kind of forced to have people spend the night. It was a community thing because it's a small town and everybody knew everyone. And so I came back and I walked into orientation on the first day of 6th grade, and they didn't know I was coming back. And so it was really weird because I had been living with adults and I hadn't been able to communicate with my peers, but to come back to people that knew me as that person and have certain expectations of small town life, it was pretty surreal for me. So middle school was an adjustment. I poured myself into my studies. So I found my space in the nerds and the band geeks and the others. Because one of the things I don't think people get about small towns is you don't really find your tribe. You just find people that are outcasts, and you guys rally around each other as much as you can to survive. So there's a certain level of tolerance in a small town, I think, for certain behaviors, just because you need somebody to have your back.
How do you mean tolerance for certain behaviors? Like, like people would mistreat you and you would overlook it to not be ostracized from that group, or like what do you mean by that?
I always assumed that the way people connected were through giving each other a hard time. It's what my older siblings had always done with me, harassed me, or making fun or making jokes. There were no boundaries. Like, there was no voice that could say, I'm not comfortable with this. I didn't learn that until probably this year, that it was okay to say that this is not okay with me. There were people that were affectionate in ways that I wasn't very comfortable with. There were things like tickling that I would want to stop. I was called things like a dyke. I was called things like, or a bitch or things like that. And it was supposed to be playful, or at least that's what I thought. But in my head, this was the first time people had wanted to be around me rather than being forced by their parents. And I knew that that was important to my family. Like, I never got social cues. I didn't understand those things. And so I tolerated this until I found a group of people that were a bunch of potheads. And I learned real fast that my quirks weren't as apparent when I hung out with stoners, and they were very accepting as long as you shared. So I became the generous giver. I also didn't take long for me to realize that if you threw the parties, you were always invited to the parties. And so my parents had met at college in Illinois, and every football season they had season tickets. And so our house had been the party house for all of my siblings. The entire band would come over, 106 people in the house. And so I just kind of took over that legacy. So every weekend they went out of town. We'd take down the dining room table. We'd move in our band. We'd set up a band. We'd have a DJ play in between sets. And we'd have 100+ people in one house doing all sorts of things that should never be on film. And thank goodness there was not social media back then. But as I started hanging out with those people, I met two different groups. One was this group of rougher guys, and I learned later that some of them ran with some motorcycle gangs that have some affiliations with white supremacists and stuff like that. And I didn't get that back then. I didn't understand prejudice because I'd grown up with military families, so everybody looked different. And so everybody was fascinating to me, and I wanted to know people. So I'd never gotten this tribalism of these are my people, because they weren't. They were, but I became their guinea pig that they would test the LSD on that would come into town. And so at this point, I'm like 7th, 8th grade, and I'm kind of like their pet. And there were many times, there were times that we were going to a concert and we ended up driving on a bridge that's closed, following a semi. There's many situations that I'm like, how easily I could have died in any one of those scenarios.
And I'm curious how you felt through this, because I have to imagine that there was part of it that was really unenjoyable, but there's also that part of feeling like you're part of something and these people want to be around you.
People wanted to be around me, and I could say anything. I didn't have to censor myself. I could be as weird as I wanted, and they would blame it on the drugs. I also liked being invited along. I realize now that inclusion had a price. I also liked being one of the guys. Because I had been in women's sports and I had been in the show choir and done all those things. But I came to an age after my first couple of years of high school in which it didn't feel right. Like me being forced in a skirt, and I wouldn't come to terms with what that meant to me. But I always felt like I was invading this space. And it wasn't a lack of respect for women. It was like an awe of women in the fact of, I'm fascinated by you, but I don't belong here. And that was pretty apparent to me. I gave up singing, and I gave up sports, and I gave up things I loved because it didn't have any give. If they would have let me put on a cummerbund and pants instead of a skirt, I would have sang forever. But instead, I started a band, and we started playing with that. But the guys, they showed up for performances. They showed up for I had a cheering crew, and nobody had ever cheered for me besides my family. The other thing that happened is some of the guys that I ran around that sold weed introduced me to a couple people that also kind of adopted me as their pet. And they used cocaine pretty heavily, this group of people. But it was the first time that I was introduced. There was a gay guy and then a trans woman that protected me within this circle. That I was naive about a lot of things, and I thought the guys always wanted me to hang out just to hang out. And there were many close calls in which Suzanne or Dwayne would be like, and they would put their foot down, and Suzanne would play Mama Bear and be like, nope, you're hanging out with us tonight. And I couldn't drive at that point, so it wasn't like I had a chance.
What were they protecting you from?
I guess I can give you an example of what happened after they left my life for a while. We were hanging out at the local pool hall, and people always would want to go smoke bud, you know. And so a guy that I'd known for a while asked if I wanted to go on a walk, you know, go smoke. And so I didn't think anything of it. Actually, what I thought of it was the fact of somebody's going to share with me for once. And so we go to take a walk, and he goes, this is the house I've been working on, because he worked in construction. And so he crawled in the window of the house and unlocked the door and let me in. It was bare bones on the inside. And when I got in there, you know, I didn't think much about it. I was smoking, I lit the joint, stuff like that. And then he pulls a mattress out of the closet. And I still was kind of oblivious, but at that moment I realized the fact that he didn't see me as a peer or a friend. And he was over 18. And
how old were you at this
14 at the time. And it was the first time I processed the fact that somebody could see me in a sexual way. He was very persistent and very forceful, but not very angry. And somewhere in my head, I was like, how did I cause this?
You thought that you were maybe signaling him that...
Yeah, I thought in my oblivion to sexual dynamics or whatever, that I had encouraged this in some way. And I mean, I didn't want to, and I wasn't comfortable, and I tried to vocalize that, and the pressure was there, and the physical dominance was there, and I just finally gave in a way. I don't know whether it was out of protection or out of guilt at that point, but I remember the post like digging splinters into my hands because I would start picking at that. My picking obsessive started about that time. I remember him distinctly throwing me the towel and go, now it's your turn to clean me. You know, like, and this instruction for every step of it. He had known me well enough to know that I wasn't going to know what to do. And at this point, I had not had sex by choice in my life. There had been an earlier incident in which that had happened, but I was not very sexually active. That wasn't on my radar. And then when he was done with me, we walked back to the pool hall, and I didn't say a word to anyone. And he will come back in my life later. But that's one of the things that they were protecting me from, that my oblivion to the fact that people wanted more than what I had to offer when it came to drugs. You know, and I figured that was the price I paid to have company, because I didn't have value in myself. I had learned my whole life that the heart of a servant, or being a servant to others, is a noble way to live. And I may not have done it in constructive ways back then, but I was trying to find a way to have friends so my parents wouldn't be as worried about me, so I would be more normal, so I could have whatever it is that people thought was good. And all of this was very anxious for me. But at that point, once that happened, that's when I dropped band, I dropped chorus. And I didn't go anywhere for a while. I would have house parties and people would come to me, but I knew I had the power in the house party to kick somebody out.
You were safe there,
yeah,
than you would be if you had gone
safer.
Safer, right,
yeah. I don't know that I ever felt safe after that, at least for a very, very long time. But I knew that the guys would back me up that were at the house party, because they would want more drugs. I didn't know that they would do it for me, but they would know that there's coke and there's weed and there's LSD if they had my back, and there would be more for them if this person was gone. At that point, I quit going near anything that was heroin related, because the uppers made me more aware. Not necessarily more aware, made me not sleep as much. And so I could pay attention more in my head. That was the logic I told myself, that I was afraid to fall asleep around anybody I didn't know, and even around people I did know. I started working church camps during the summer to try and create a buffer between me and this drug life. And I lived a very dual life. I was the vice president of the Tennessee Methodist Youth Conference. I ran the youth service fund for the entire state of Tennessee. I went to the BMCR, which is the Black Methodist for Church Renewal, and I was the only white person in the entire audience that talked about social justice in Pulaski. And this was in the early 90s as somebody who's 15, just getting their license and stuff like that. And so I tried to pour myself in being a servant in other ways. But at that point, my drug use was so heavy. And when I came home, the only real thing that I knew to do in order to not be alone was to use. And about the time that I was a junior in high school, I had finally made some friends that were female friends. And they invited me out to go to a bonfire party, which was pretty big. And it was all upperclassmen, and I went with them. And of course, again, I was oblivious to the fact that, there were just 6 of us out there, and there happened to be 3 girls and 3 guys. And at some point during the evening, the 2 of them went off with guys, and there was an instance in where I was pushed face down in the mud and taken from behind by one of the guys that was an athlete at our high school. And I was working church camp that summer, and I busted one of the guys trying to have sex with one of the girls in one of the rooms. I was a junior counselor at the time. And so we spent about 7 hours talking about how to respect people and how to love people and of course, it's all riddled with this religious dogma of, stuff I don't necessarily believe that love is now. It would probably be more codependence and that type of thing that we're talking about.
What strikes me is that you have an experience that's very, very in opposition to what I'm guessing you're telling this kid.
Of what love should be?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's going through your head at this point? I mean, are you able to compartmentalize that enough to where you didn't realize gosh, I'm telling this kid everything that I should really know myself, or how did that work out in your head?
In my head, I thought that I knew how to love people. I just hadn't met somebody who knew how to love me yet. And so
you had an awareness of the unhealthiness of the situations that you were in by this point.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Okay. That makes sense.
However, I thought I was the one who created them in a lot of different ways by my naivete.
Gotcha.
The fact that I thought it was my obliviousness to social, I didn't read people. I didn't understand ulterior motives. And so I'm talking to this guy, and in my head, I was protecting the girl. I didn't know this guy at all. And my thing is, I could only imagine if I went to church camp and I lost my virginity at church camp, and that was the story, I chose that. To me, that would have been worse coming home because of the spiritual shaming than anything I had been through to this point in my life. And so he and I talked, and he made some realizations. And then when they were getting ready to leave, when their bus was going to pull out, he made his bus driver pull over, and he came out and he kissed me in front of everybody. As kind of a romantic thing, at least in my head, I was like, this is the movie thing. We've talked about relationships and respecting women all night, and here's this guy that's appreciative. And in my head, I thought this was what you meet a guy at age 16 or 17 and you fall in love and you live happily ever after. And I thought that was the beginning of this. And he and I, along with one of our other friends, started working church camps together, and he would travel down here and do that type of thing. And then on his birthday, they lived in McMinnville. They'd drop me off here, and I didn't know the girl that was driving. That I'd met her that day, and she fell asleep at the wheel, and it killed him and one of our other friends. And so the only person that I thought had tried to go on this journey of love with me, and I was able to be honest with him. I was able to say, I'm attracted to women, I'm attracted to men. We would check out girls together. It was a very raw conversation. And he ended up having a good heart. And I was lucky. But again, that first kiss caught me so off guard that there was nothing about, I don't know that it was ever consensual. I don't know that, I think that I freeze when somebody tries to advance toward me because I'm completely oblivious to the fact that I might be an object of attraction or a target, either one of those things, depending on their mindset. So I lost him, and I decided that.
And
go ahead.
what is, I mean, so what does that do? Because, until now you've had a very long series of extraordinarily unhealthy relationships.
Yeah.
And, it seemed like this guy, may have been one of the first ones that was at least like halfway in a good place.
Yeah.
And so you lose him.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, tell me about that, what that does to your head.
I thought he was the exception to my lesbian rule. I thought that I gave up on men at that point in my life. I knew that every guy I dated after that I would compare to him. He was the first one that I thought I would be able to have sex with and it be consensual. Because the thought of sex being a positive thing had been taken away from me a long time before that. And just male anatomy and or people assign male at birth anatomy, I saw them as weapons and tools at that point, which had a little bit of internal self-hatred. It took me a long time to come to terms with my maleness. And that pretty much happened this year that I came to terms with that.
Gosh, talk to me about that conflict, because what I'm hearing is almost every guy in my life has been a massive piece of shit to me. And at the same time, I know that I am one on one level or another.
Well, and that's the thing, like, on the other side of it, my dad has the biggest heart in the world, and he's the most gentle person in the world. But I only got to see the second half of the relationship, not the early years of their marriage. So it was very codependent toward the end, especially when he was, he had dementia toward the end, and he was dependent on mom. So, like, I felt like his love towards mom, I'd never have somebody that would stick with me through that part of things. So the guys that were my age, it was like, there's this dominance and there's this unappreciation of women that I met some amazing women growing up. That I really wanted to be a part of that inner circle. Like, I really wanted to belong, and they were welcoming, but I also knew there was part of me that didn't belong. And at that point in my life, I really thought it was because I was attracted to women. So I dismissed it as that side of it. But when it came to guys, like, I craved this bond of brotherhood. But at the same time, like, I didn't know how to look at the male body, or the commonly accepted male body that I understood at that time, and see anything but fear. I fought that so long. And even now, when I think about things like surgeries and stuff like that, I'm like, I don't know if I'll ever be able to commit to bottom surgery. Because while dysphoria is very real, having something on my body that triggers me like that can also be difficult.
It's a no-win scenario.
I'll find a solution.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of healing to be done, but no, it's hard to, and again, I don't come to terms with the fact that I'm a guy until another 20 years. Mm-hmm. So, but at this point, I'd pretty much given up on love, and I was going to go to college, and I was going to go into the ministry, and I was going to be celibate.
And you were still doing the double life with the drugs and that at this point?
I was. And then I decided when I was going to go to this private religious college, there were a bunch of people that I had been working church camp with that were going to go to this place too. I'm like, this is my chance at a fresh start. And so I go there. And the sorority sisters want me to pledge. The fraternity brothers asked me to be in a band with some of the guys. And then there's partying and there's drinking and there's that type of thing. And I felt like I was home for a while. I hung out with a lot of the international students that played soccer and did that type of thing. And then I started to come to terms with the fact that I kind of had a crush on one of my sorority sisters, one of my pledge sisters. And it kind of came out that we were fooling around. And so I got talked to by my advisor in the fact that my candidacy for ministry was going to be denied because I wasn't straight. And so that spun me out for a while. And I started using coke with some people that were there. One of my friends that I played in a band with part of the time, had a mom that lived in the area. And she smoked bud too. And we would go over there and chill on Saturday nights and smoke. But around the same time this was happening, we went over to her house and she wasn't home. She had made some jambalaya. The stove was still warm. We ate. Then we went the next day and she wasn't. We couldn't find her. We went the next day and we couldn't find her. But on day 3, the apartment started to smell and we thought it was the food. We start cleaning and we find her under the bed. And she had been drinking bleach water for 3 days and defecated on herself, trying to kill herself. And we had been in that apartment with her, not knowing that she was there. She had hid under the bed every time we came. And that visual image of my friend pulling his mom out from under that and trying to clean her. And he looks at me and goes, "You just need to go." I wanted to help him, but I respected his request to back off. But between that and between not being able to go in the ministry, I kind of had a breakdown in the fact of, I don't know how to erase this image from my head. I don't know how to go back in there. I don't know how to look at him. And we talked, but us looking at each other in the eyes, like life was never going to be the same. And so I went up to Memphis for the weekend to kind of get away, and there was a feminist rally at University of Memphis. And I ended up transferring up there and hanging out with a bunch of riot girls and doing underground zines up in the Memphis area, just as a way to escape. And I decided I wanted to go into digital media when I was up there. And then my advisor told me that there would never be a career in digital media. Yeah, that face. That face.
Right.
I make that face about 50 million times. So at this point, everything that I've wanted to do, I've been told you can't do.
Personally and professionally
Yeah.
at this point.
Yeah, pretty much. And so you think about when you're a kid, you can do anything you want to do, you can be anything you want to be, and love is unconditional. I'm learning throughout my life that life is pretty much a lie. You know?
And who could blame you for coming to that conclusion, right?
Well, and that's the thing, like, I didn't get at that point that even them telling me I was a girl was a lie. Like, even them, like, telling me
The most basic stuff.
the most basic things. So, like, everything was false. Like, I knew there wasn't a Santa, but they tell people that there's a Santa. I knew love wasn't unconditional because I knew where the barriers were, not necessarily with my family, because I'm learning that there's a lot more unconditional love than I once realized back then. But I knew there were conditions. I knew that love wasn't love. I knew that at least their concept of love wasn't something that I craved, although there was a part of me that really craved belonging. And when you have social anxiety, it's this duality of not wanting to be near people, but wanting to have people. And I don't know how to explain that unless you've experienced it.
Yeah. And I imagine there's also a bit of, like, once you get that, the constant anxiety of, like, messing it up. Like, I'm going to be awkward. I'm going to say something silly, like that kind of thing. And so, like, I desperately want this thing. Oh, I've got this thing. Now it's really scary for another reason.
Oh, yeah. So, oh, yeah. And I don't know. And I would overthink everything. I still do. But I'm like, for the long time, the only reason I thought that people wanted me around was the drugs and because I threw the parties. And when I get a little bit of something in my system, my stutter goes away. You'll notice that I stutter a little bit. I've gotten it kind of under control. And my tics, my body tics when I take stimulants, so they don't notice the habitual tics that came along. But I don't know. My mind, I don't know if we're allowed to cuss, but it was.
Oh, yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
It was a mind fuck. It on a whole nother level of the fact, here I am, this person that's supposed to be super intelligent, even despite the fact that I'm killing brain cells at a level that's ridiculous. And I can't figure out how to talk or be in a room with people and trust that I'm not the next target of whatever is going on in their head. And in my head, I don't know what I'm doing to trigger that reaction to me. And one of the things that also happened through high school, if you take from 94 until about 2003, like high school and my college years, I had 27 close friends die. And so every time I would get a phone call from somebody that I thought would be a reunion or wanting to come hang out, it was announcing that somebody else died. And so I had to pack up everything and come back to this town and bury another person.
Was it drugs?
Some of it was drugs. Some of it was heart conditions. Some of it was getting hit by trains. Sometimes there's blind spots. we lost a lot of people to a lot of different reasons. Mental health in the area needs some support. Most of the people I knew, the reason I didn't go to counseling or even ask for counseling, would always tell me how to manipulate the people in order to get drugs. And so I knew if I went into that office that it was another hookup for me. It wasn't about solving anything that I was feeling, because of course God's going to save me. I had already died twice. He has big plans for me. That's what I've been told. And at this point, I hadn't realized that that was something else I had to unlearn.
You already died twice. Expand on that.
The first was the seizure when my dad had to do CPR on me to revive me when I was in 3rd grade. And the next time was when I had mono and my body temperature had to be dunked in a bathtub of ice. I don't know that my heart stopped at that one because I wasn't hooked to monitors, but I know my heart stopped on the first one. And so I kept hearing things in my youth like, God must have special plans for you. You know, he's preparing you for what you're going to have to face. And in my mind, I'm like, oh, fuck, what else am I going to have to face? Like, if all of this in my life is preparation and fortifying me for whatever else is to come, I lived in fear of the future.
And these people think they're comforting you.
Absolutely.
When they're saying this.
Yeah. Or like when somebody would die, they would be like, oh, grandma's watching you from heaven. Of course, I'm freaked out to like do anything because grandma sees everything. Like, so when it comes to healthy sexual exploration, when it comes to even saying the words, I'm gay out loud, or I'm queer out loud, or I lived in fear that everybody I knew that had ever died could see everything that I had ever done. And I knew at that point in my life, at least this was my truth at that point in life, that I had been created as a being that was an abomination, that had no way to get into an eternity that wasn't hellfire. So I had accepted this truth that maybe he's just preparing me for hell. And I don't know that I ever spoke those words at that point. But a lot of the words that people used to comfort a lot of people were a source of further frustration for me. But then I ended up hanging out with a group of women and one guy that were into Wicca, and joined a coven at this point in my life because I was pretty much done with God. And so I was finally part of a sisterhood that they didn't shame bodies. You could talk about whatever it was. And the way that I met my partner at the time is I was at a coffee shop, and I was out in a back alley, and I was parking because the parking was around back, and I'm walking up the alley, and I gave somebody a hug, and I won't say her name, but she was just starting to transition, and had chosen a new name, and I was like, hey, Miss Thing, you know, whatever, and gave a big hug, and this country boy came with his belt buckle and started wailing on me with the belt, and all of a sudden, somebody came out and called them off, and I didn't even realize who it was at that point. And they ran off. But then I ended up, they invited me into this coffee shop, and this coffee shop ended up being one of my second families. And I met somebody that I know as Sister Ruby, and invited me into this circle of people. And so we would go and gather in the woods, or we would gather in places that were out of the city when we need to, but we would sit and play guitar out in the middle of the alley, and she would introduce me to Midtown, which is where a lot of the LGBT community is. But there was music, and there was healing, and there was still some unhealthy habits, a lot of unhealthy habits, but there were people that had my back. So I kind of found a tribe there. And so I started trying to go to NA meetings and stuff like that, but it became very cultish. Like at my concept of cultish at that point, at this point, I don't know what I would call it, but for me, it was like a replacement addiction. Like it was a bunch of people in a room talking about using all the time that would just make me want to go use. Like that's what it did for me. Now it works for some people, and I'm not going to disrespect the people that it works for. And so I started running around with a bunch of kids that, and by kids, I mean young adults, or some of them were still kids, that were in the rave scene. And so we started having raves to raise money to bail people out of jail, or, you know, a bunch of misfits. And I kind of became, at that point, the mama bear. Actually, they called me dad at that point. It was funny. But my friend, I called him my cousin at the time. He wasn't really my cousin, but it kind of gave him an in with some of the older people to trust him. And he had pretty much turned his back on me at this point, but we were at a party, and all of a sudden my phone rings, and it's him. And I could hear the sobbing. And this is a guy that's running drugs left and right, that's dealing with some pretty heavy hitters. I've never seen him cry in my life. And so I go, and his face is running with snot, and there's a person with a gun, and I put my body between, and I still have a chipped tooth from a gun being forced in my mouth. Like it was one of those things. I'm like, at that point I was ready to die anyway. But I didn't have the balls to take my own life. So I didn't see myself as something as precious as the people that I would try and protect. I had pulled up loud enough that people heard, and I busted out yelling, so it drew enough attention. I'd squealed the tires, loud entrances draw attention, and so people had come around the edge of the gas station, and he took off because there was an audience.
Gotcha.
And then that guy, the friend that I was going to see, I'm trying not to use names because
you're fine.
Illegal activities,
right?
He got in the car and snot running down his face, and I looked at him. He goes, "Just drive." And so I drove for 20 minutes before we went back to the club because he didn't ride with me, and he had people that was riding with him. And I drove till he was done crying. He goes, "Okay, I'm ready now." Those are the only words we ever said about it, ever. Now, about a month and a half later, we went on a period of having a house party, and then there was a rave we were going to go to. My parents were out of town. And so we had let time get away with us, so we had left some food out and stuff like that while we were cooking, and we were like, it's time to go to the rave. We'll clean this up when we get back. So we go to the rave, and we go to an after party, and he's like, I need to go make a run. Can I use your car? And so I loan him my car keys to go make a run, and I stay at this apartment with some of my other friends. And then one of our other friends went to make a different drug run in a different direction, which was the person I had met these other two friends through. At that point, I had started to play with needles. I wasn't actually injecting, but I was trying to see if I had the courage to inject, which had resulted in an abscess in my arm on this side. I didn't realize that one of the people in the house had a history with heroin and injecting. And so I'm guessing it was very trigger for him. And so my friend, guy friend, had taken off with my car to Nashville, and somebody else had gone to make a run to Clarksville. And so I'm in the house with two other people, and I didn't realize this whole time they had been stealing my drugs. Like, I knew they were getting less and less, but I thought I was losing track of them. And so I go outside to smoke a cigarette, and at this point I do have a cell phone, but the battery's getting kind of low. I'm sitting there smoking a cigarette, and all of a sudden I hear the door click behind me. And then I hear the other door open and close, and then I go over there, and all my stuff is laying outside. And so they've locked me out of the house and closed all the blinds. And so I go into a full-on panic attack. Like, there's nobody I know. I don't have a way to escape. My car's not here. And then I get a call from this friend, and now I'm using air quotes, that's gone up to Nashville.
The friend who borrowed your car?
Yeah, the one that I dealt with the gun thing with. And he said, and this was after I'd been outside for, probably 7 hours. The sun was up, and they hadn't made it back yet, said that he had to go back to town, but he would leave my car there for me to get. And this was a different town. And I had no way to go get my car. And he also didn't tell me that he left the keys with the person he was picking up drugs from, who had been awake for 12 days. So I hitchhiked my way up to Nashville from the town that I'm in. And I see my car. And at this point, my parents have come home to a messy house, and so I'm scared to death to go home because I know that there was all sorts of things laying. This is probably the first time my parents became aware that I used drugs. And I couldn't get into my car. I didn't know what house it was. Nobody was answering the door. And so I basically was on the street for a little while. And then a few days later, one of my friends came and I found there was a homeless guy that taught me how to keep warm by shoving magazines in my clothes and my socks. And then there was a lady that told me, if you go into Verizon and plug in your phone, you can charge it. And I knew my parents hadn't shut off my phone, but I was so dirty from being outside, and I was so gross, and I'd been picking at my skin, and my arm was abscessed. And the thought of going into a public place scared me. Calling home, like I had been this religious person that they didn't know I was gay. Or that's how I identified at the time. They didn't know anything about me. So I don't think they had any clue why I didn't go into the ministry, why I was denied. And I had all the shame of not being able to say, look, I love people differently. But I also had all the shame of I had failed them by being born different. And so some of my friends that were down here came and got me. And they let me sleep on their couch while my arm healed and helped me detox. And then one of them got upset because they thought I was flirting with his girlfriend. He got very territorial. And her and I are really good friends. I can never see us dating, but we were very much like sisters at that point in our life. We're just very raw with each other. And so he went up there and he tried to help me get my car and tried to help me get the keys. And we finally figured out a way to get the car back to town. But at this point, I couldn't go home in my mind. I think my parents would have let me go home now. But at that point, I was like, now they know I'm a drug user. There's no way for me to explain all this without coming out. And the thought of losing that, air quotes, unconditional love scared me. One of the other things that happened is when my oldest sister went away to college, she had come out. And she went through a lot of rough things in college and had a relationship that wasn't real healthy. But she had always told me how much mom and dad hated that she was gay. And so I had this narrative of her internal dialogue. She would tell me, I've known you were a lesbian since you were 4 years old. So this projection of this is your identity on top of mom and dad will hate you if they know this, so. And that's what was going on in her head. That was her journey and where she was. But it kind of helped when it came to paralyzing me. To be humble and vulnerable and go ask for the type of support I needed, not the type of support I wanted, was not within my power at that point. At least I didn't think it was. And so my ex, Allison, that was down in Knoxville, said she'd come get me. And I moved in with her. And after a while, we ended up dating again. And she got accepted to grad school down in Florida. And so we ended up moving. At this point, I reconciled with my parents. They never got the whole story, but they were just glad I was talking to them again and glad I was with somebody they knew. And I was like, I need to go somewhere for a fresh start. So I go down to Florida with her, and she's a grad student. She's studying marine biology. She's intelligent. They approve of her. They don't know we're dating. But my parents kind of adopt every friend in my life. Like she got every Christmas present that I got. She got, cutesy things. Like they even called her Robin's. What we got referred to in couple terms, even though they didn't know we were a couple.
Gotcha. So in their mind, it was just a very healthy friendship, and they were glad that you had that.
Yeah, a healthy roommate. I finally was hanging out with a girl instead of only the guys, and it was somebody that's actually in school applying themselves. Of course, they didn't really know she was Wiccan, and they didn't know. Like there were certain points that I left out of the truth in our different narrative, and they knew that I had been going to school when we talked before, and knew that. Thing is, she always traveled to come see me when I was in Memphis. Like, I would have gone her way, but she was just all of her friends were up there anyway. But so she always came to see me, and they knew that somebody had made an effort to be in my life. And I think that was reassuring in a way. And so, I mean, she called them mom and dad. That wasn't weird at all for, and we helped renovate the apartment and stuff like that. And I went back to school down there, and I ended up doing all right when I started working on my associates. I went ahead to get a degree in English to start with. But there was a point where we went out to dinner with some of her colleagues at school. It was one of our mutual friends' birthday. And I started to have an anxiety attack. And I said, I need to leave. And she goes, you can find a way home. I didn't realize she had been attracted to, or I don't know if they had been flirting. I don't know how far back it went. But she had met a guy that she would marry for her first marriage. And so in the middle of being in Florida and away from everybody and stuff like that, and don't get me wrong, I had not been nurturing that relationship. I had all the douchebag habits of being an addict. I didn't know how to not be codependent and to support the emotions in a way where the other person wasn't trying to save me, you know? And that was the role. She tried, like, there was a condescension in the fact of she always knew she had it more together than I did. And she was very strong and independent, and I don't begrudge that because it was true. She had it more together than I was. And she had rescued me. But the public breakup was hard on me in the way it was done. But part of that was also my social anxiety and the fact of, you know, all those nightmares you have of people witnessing the most horrible parts of your life. This is one of those dreams.
And it actually happened.
Yeah. And so she ended up moving out. And a few months later, right before graduation, Hurricane Ivan hit and destroyed the home we had had together. And we had rented. And so one of the things that happens in a hurricane is that the renters are pretty low on the list for help, especially ones that aren't elderly or I didn't have kids. Like, there wasn't much support for me. So again, I was homeless. And there wasn't much power. And so I drove up to Tennessee for a while, but the thought of coming back here at that point in my life was very, very hard. And I started using crack. Now, I'd been using meth, but I got to the point where I couldn't afford that. So I did what I could for crack. And then when I was up here, I had brought one of my friends with me to kind of be a refuge from where the power had shut down. We ordered pizza because I didn't go out in public and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, the person shows up to deliver the pizza, and it's the guy that raped me when I was 14. And it hit me all of a sudden that every one of those demons were still in this town. And so all of a sudden I felt like I couldn't go in public. I couldn't order food. I couldn't, because pizza is the only thing that delivers in this small town. And I lost it. Like, I mean, I went on crack use, bouncing couch to couch. I would loan out my car to people for a place to stay. They wrecked 3 different cars that I had gotten through this process. I'd go down to Florida and break into an old apartment that I had to sleep for a while down there until I was chased off. And I would run drugs back and forth to bring to people that were down there. Not necessarily me, but I would give people rides to do it. I'd never had that high of a connection because I'd used too much to ever make money off of it, that's for sure. But I just used crack steady from like basically 2004 to 2007. And the first couple times, I finally left Florida altogether. What happened is one of my friends came up with me and bought a whole bunch of meth and then went back down there and went off the deep end. And so all of my friends that were down there blamed me. And so I kind of got shunned from the group of people that had been my support network down there. So I came back up here for good. I figured that I had burned my bridges down there. And through all this, I'm pretty suicidal. So, like, you know, it is what it is when it came to that. But I came up here and I started using drugs. And then Katrina happened in New Orleans, and a bunch of people were relocated up here. And so I kind of connected with them over that. But there was also a bunch of people that used drugs that came up here. People that didn't grow up in small town USA. So they would borrow my cars and I would stay at a house while they went and ran crack around town. And I didn't realize that I was having seizures. They would say I had a seizure in front of them and I didn't believe them because it was just blacked out time.
You just thought you were blacking out from the drugs?
I didn't even know I was blacking out. Like, you blink and you're in a different position. And so it was one of those things that, like, I didn't believe it at first until I realized that I felt a pattern. I would bite my tongue, and I would end up with blood coming out of the sides of my tongue every time I had a seizure. And it took me about 3 or 4 of those to realize that that's what's happening. It didn't stop me from using. There was a point where you always give the house some of your drugs wherever you're hanging out. So somebody was going to take my car, so I needed a place to crash. So I hung out on this couch and gave one of these guys some drugs in order to be able to crash on his couch. And then once he was done using the drugs, he goes, okay, now you have to find another way to pay. And he shoved his cock in my mouth at this point, and I had no way to leave, and I had nowhere to go. And I was in this place where, is it worse being on the street? Is it worse being here? And the truth is, the only thing I really wanted was my next fix. And I ended up going out further outside to the edge of town to a house with some people I'd known from my youth that still used. And I met a girl and actually got engaged to this girl. I kind of cleaned up my act a little bit. I still partied. And then after we had a night where we were celebrating something like that, and we had gotten some coke, and I cooked part of it to crack, and then I overdosed in her arms. And that was the end of that relationship, because when I came to, all I was looking for was my pipe. And she couldn't do it, and I respect her for making that choice for herself, big time, because I was a shithead to her, as addicts often are when they're caught in that chaos, but that doesn't justify the way she was treated at all. At that point, I ended up going to stay at my sister's, the one that, not my oldest sister, but my sister that had pretty much raised me. And my nephew had just been born. And so I was like, okay, I've got to get my shit together. I've got a nephew now. I'm going to do this. And I ended up overdosing again. And when I overdosed and was in the hospital, my sister had gone through my bags and found that I had been stockpiling medication from different people and stealing them. Nothing that could get you high. I just wanted to take enough pills to not be anymore. And so she looked at me and goes, you've got to go to rehab or we're done. And I knew at that point in my life, I either had to choose to live, not just survive. Because up until that point in my life, my entire level of strength was survival. Like, that was my measure. How much crap we can take is the measure of our worth in this world. And I see a lot of people that are like that. And I had never thought of having a future. I had never thought of hope. I had never thought of living. Surviving was the best I had ever aimed for. And so I looked at them and I go, as long as it's not Christian.
And so ends part 1 of the story. Next week, we're going to hear about Robin's journey through recovery and figure out how it's possible to be indoctrinated into a religion without even knowing it. That, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto. If you think what we do here is important, please share this around to your friends. Search the Gaytheist Manifesto on Facebook and Twitter to find us there. I'm at Gaytheist Callie on Twitter. You can email us at podcast@thegaytheistmanifesto.com. We're a part of the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative. We're a group of trans podcasting badasses working to bring more trans voices into podcasting and other content creation. Search the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative on Facebook for more info. If you want to support the show and the activism we do, you can head to patreon.com/thegaytheistmanifesto and make a per episode donation as little as $1 per episode. If that's not in the cards, you can give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and share us around to your friends. It all helps and it all makes a difference. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.